So before we get started and kind of dive into our fireside chat, maybe just a quick introduction, a little bit about Ninefin and its kind of founding story and history and how we ended up where we are here today. So my background originally was working at JP Morgan, as Jess mentioned, in the leverage finance team, helping companies issue bonds and loans to fund buyouts or kind of expand their businesses. And I did that for a few years in London. And then after that, I left and went to the buy side and worked at Babson Capital, now known as Barings, and was a credit analyst there. And basically, Ninefin came from my personal frustrations in the early part of my career about the lack of data and the lack of technology in a lot of our market and a lot of the kind of work that I had to do day to day. And I saw a lot of problems that I thought could be solved with technology. And I complained about them. And one of the people I complained to was my flatmate and friend from university, Huss, in London, and eventually convinced him to come and start Ninefin to try and build a massive business to try and solve problems in the debt world using technology. So that was a little over 8 years ago. And now we've got offices in London and New York, nearly 300 people, and work with kind of large investment banks, asset managers, law firms, etc., through the Ninefin platform. So Ninefin has always embraced technology. In fact, our very first company tagline was AI-powered financial data extraction back in 2016 and 17. So we were doing AI stuff before it was kind of cool and the fad. But really excited to be here today and talking on this topic. So Sujeet, over to you.
Great. Well, it's great to talk to you, Stephen, and hear about what you guys are doing and your thoughts on AI and credit markets. Obviously, it's something we're paying attention to. So maybe the place to kick off is just, I'll have a couple of background thoughts here. So high finance is like the ultimate apprenticeship job. You and I did this job. It's high value. There's a lot of intellectual content. It takes years of experience and learning from other masters to ultimately become that like decision maker and the person who's making like the buy-sell decision. And if you do those well, you can like make a lot of money, right? And so to get to that point, I mean, the job requires like pattern recognition in financial analysis, legal analysis, corporate analysis, and then you put that all together and you apply like judgment, which is science and an art. And markets are generally pretty efficient, I think, and maybe you have different thoughts on that. But it's already hard to make excess returns, right? It's so competitive. So the job itself probably hasn't changed that much, for better or worse, in 30 or 40 years. I mean, there's new versions of Excel every few years, but the way your boss learned this job is probably the way you learned it. And maybe we thought that's how the people we trained were going to do it. So at a high level, I guess the question is AI finally going to be that game changer tool, killer app that's going to like fundamentally like alter the way like credit investing is done?
I think it'll probably be evolution rather than revolution. I mean, whenever people think about kind of AI, today what most people think about is by AI is LLMs. And LLMs, although kind of reasonably new, ChatGPT first came out 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
So we haven't seen kind of complete mass change of how kind of credit markets and investment banking work just yet. But as we know, kind of credit markets and credit investors can be a little bit slower to adopt new technologies. We're generally risk-averse people. We're kind of focused on downside risk. But I think there is a big opportunity for these types of technologies to change quite a lot in terms of how people work, make them much more efficient, do a lot of the kind of more mundane tasks that typically people would have had to do in their apprenticeship as you and I did.
Yeah. I was asking this earlier. Is there an LLM that has passed CFA level 1 yet? Is that
so? I think they did some. I think there's some versions that have been tweaked or with some extra prompting that have managed to pass some of the CFA exams.
Yeah.
But I think not the kind of standalone original version of ChatGPT.
Okay.
I think didn't.
All right. Well, that day might be coming, so that would be a game changer. So just drilling down a little bit more, and you hinted at this a little bit, but are the AI tools that you're seeing and you're experimenting with, are they going to become the analyst or just a tool for the analyst? Like how transformative do you think, at least in maybe the next 3 to 5 years, AI could be for this job?
They can be pretty transformative, but not for every single task. I think there are some tasks that LLMs are extremely good at. So, for example, summarizing large amounts of information is something that LLMs are very capable of doing. Also, search and Q&A and information retrieval from large kind of stores of data.
Yeah.
Also very good at doing that. And then also last mile kind of text generation. So things like drafting parts of memos, things like that, very good at. I think the challenge is, do we envisage a world in 3 to 5 years' time where you can have an LLM or an AI agent that can do the Altice restructuring,
Right.
or can put together kind of a complex LME proposal. I'm not sure we're quite at that stage of kind of evil revolution.
Yeah, the
just
question
yet.
is like when you were thinking about an LME, could you just ask the LME, LLM to decide, did you want to do the up tier, the drop down, the double dip, which is the best one? What do the documents allow? We're not there quite yet, are we?
No, and I think, if you, in order to answer some of those much more complex questions, you need a lot of information, you need a lot of context, there's a lot of game theory that goes into it as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of that kind of nuance is lost on some of these kind of financial models. But if you're saying what happened on a company earnings call,
Yeah.
what did the management team say? What was the sentiment? Did they mention anything about, the outlook? Those are the types of questions that, LLMs can answer very quickly. And one of the tools that kind of we built at 9fin was around earnings calls in particular, where we'll dial in and transcribe all the calls and give you kind of an automated summary in real time of anything that kind of happened
Yeah.
on the call. And that's one of the things that I used to do kind of on the buy side.
Right.
I had to dial into all the company calls, and they host them all at exactly the same time.
Right.
And so you can't dial into all the calls. And so things like that.
And there's only like 2 or 3 minutes that matter. You should know which 2 or 3 minutes, right? And so now you can have the model just figure out what was the important moment and don't have to listen to the other 38
Exactly.
minutes.
So I think like summarization tasks, very good. Things like news flow monitoring, kind of first pass draft of certain documents or things about a business.
Yeah.
These models are very capable of. If it's more complex tasks like structuring LMEs or negotiations, or even things like quality of earnings, if you're assessing EBITDA adjustments and saying, is this add back reasonable or sensible, or what do we think of it?
Yeah.
That's something today that's going to be quite hard for an LLM to answer. And so a lot of the things as well in our market around financial nuance, like, how does working capital impact this company? Some of these models aren't quite there yet, but for kind of broad summarization and Q&A, they're pretty good.
Yeah. And then just on just analyzing large chunks of data, I guess what are you seeing right now in terms of what is available and what people are using? Because there is an element of these jobs which is just truly the data dump and trying to make sense of either a particular company or a set of transactions or market trends. Anything there that's been interesting to you?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people are kind of looking at, these models generally are trained on the internet. And so can kind of at first pass answer pretty well a lot of the questions that that can be found on the internet. But then the question is, how do you integrate your own data sources into these types of models, and how do you pass information from tools like 9fin to these types of models and get good answers? And the challenge there is, what's the right context to send a model? You're getting bigger and bigger context windows, but how do I send the information that's going to get me the right answer, is going to help me interrogate the data? And then also, how do I feel about sending some of my data, either my company's data or kind of proprietary data, to these types of models in order to get questions? And people get nervous about that.
Yeah. So I know you have questions out there, so please send those in through the chat in the webinar and the Zoom, and we'll get to those as you have them, and then especially towards the end of our time. There was the story recently, the CEO of Goldman Sachs had said AI can draft 95% of an IPO prospectus, which, if you've seen an IPO prospectus already, prospectus that maybe isn't shocking given a lot of it is boilerplate and fill in the blank, and but it is time consuming. It is a legal document. There's securities lawyers who charge a lot of money to do that very basic work. I guess, what is your view on like a statement like that? Like how do you think that number could get to 99 or 100? And if you are a securities lawyer or a banker who's putting together a memo or a prospectus or some kind of legal document, which is like long and largely tedious, but there is important stuff in there, and there is an element of like storytelling and marketing, and you want to get it right, apart from just avoiding like legal liability. What do you think that 95? Did you agree with that 95% number right now, given where the technology is and what you've seen, and like where do you think that could?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about a lot of these securities prospectuses, whether it's an IPO prospectus or a debt prospectus, the lawyers typically don't start with a blank canvas and a blank piece of paper and draft every single clause. It starts usually from a precedent, from a prior transaction, or from kind of an industry guideline, and then they're kind of tweaking around the edges. So I think the 95% comment, quite a lot of these documents are kind of similar and overlap anyway. So you can get to quite a high percentage number, I think, with boilerplate or cookie cutter stuff that goes into the document. But it's probably how all of the various different clauses interact, that the last 5% that's maybe different versus the cookie cutter stuff that really matters. And then ultimately in our space, I mean, it's a regulated world, and ultimately the lawyers, the underwriters, the companies are ultimately responsible for what goes in that document. So even if you can get to kind of 95% of the document being generated automatically or via template or a precedent, ultimately you as a human are accountable, and as a firm are accountable for what makes it into the final 100% of the doc. So I think drafting first passes of some of these documents is a pretty good problem for LLMs to solve, but ultimately it's that kind of last mile piece that could really get you in trouble if you get it wrong. And we've seen with some of the legal cases where lawyers have drafted some of their submissions to courts, and it's made up a case that didn't exist, and then subsequently they had issues in terms of malpractice. So I think it can help with some of the heavy lifting, but I think there were tools around before that did some of that heavy lifting as well.
Yeah. So we have a question from Karthik Maheshwari. He writes, as a junior in college studying economics with a job offer in credit and more specifically in asset-backed finance, should I learn computer science on the side to hedge against AI potentially taking over much of the analyst responsibilities in the coming years? And so if we take what you just said about this last mile stuff, and ultimately these are legal documents where people are accountable, and if there's a mistake, there's going to be a big problem. I think about this a lot. Like, again, I said earlier, this was an apprentice job, and we learned how to spread comps from hand and go through 10Ks and how to read them and make the adjustments. And that was really hard and tedious. And then as we moved along in our career and technology improved, I mean, there was Capital IQ and FactSet, which you could kind of download the comps if you wanted to. And, that was a lot faster than spreading them by hand. But we learned a lot by going through 10Ks about the companies and reporting and how to make those adjustments. And this question, I think, kind of gets to this point a little bit, right? Like, how do you balance, using the technology, which is powerful, but also developing like the judgment and critical thinking skills? And so when you do have to write that last mile part of the document or the analysis, like, do you worry about, how people are trained and what they should be spending their time on? And ultimately, do we become too dependent on like what's really powerful technology?
It's a tricky question because a lot of the whenever we show things that 9fin can do, for example, in terms of saving people time, a lot of the more kind of senior bankers or lawyers at kind of firms that we show this to say, this is amazing, this can save so much time, but I didn't have it. People should have to go through the same pain and suffering that I went through and do everything by hand. So I think there is like a little bit of hesitance around how do people upskill and learn the job if portions of the job are kind of now being more automated or done in a more automated fashion. I think it's a little bit difficult to crystal ball because I think a lot of the skills that you have within kind of front office finance and deal making are going to be quite hard to fully kind of automate away. So I think it's going to be more a tool that augments an analyst. So, instead of, spending ages copy and pasting things out of a document or, pulling numbers, you might already have it in the format that you need. And then the question is, okay, how are you going to forecast these numbers? How are you, what do you think of quality of earnings? What do you think about this kind of disclosure? So I think it'll free up people to do a lot more of the interesting kind of work. So, and then also I think the, learning computer science on the side, one of the big questions that's been coming out with some of the Copilot apps is maybe some of the engineering might be automated in terms of how, how much code is actually written now by LLMs. So I think it does no harm to have some technical experience and understand how some of the new technologies work, and it'll make you more effective in your job. But I'm not sure you need to do a hard pivot into comp sci over finance.
Okay, interesting. And then there's some people, who think that liberal arts subjects are actually more important than ever, right? Because the technology is becoming so good that, in fact, developing like critical thinking skills and communication, so the human skills, are more important than ever because the tech stuff is going to be commoditized to some extent. So that's another interesting thing to think about too.
And 100%. I mean, I think as well, a lot of doing deals in our space is relationship. And having a good relationship with the private equity sponsor or having a good relationship with the end client and being able to walk them through how a transaction works. So I think there's still quite a lot of things in our space where I don't think you're going to have, AI agents going out and pitching kind of in client meetings. And then similarly, in terms of how we think about things at 9fin, like there are some bits of information that are new or novel that you can't find from the internet or an existing LLM. A conversation that happened about a restructuring that you heard from a source, or some bit of kind of proprietary analysis that we produce. You can't just kind of magic those things up with an LLM.
Yeah. Well, on that note, there's a question from anonymous attendee. It would be great for 9fin to create a database which uses AI to pick up elements of all restructurings, which we could use as an example precedents from our deals in financial advisory. For example, if we had a case where had specific elements such as a PE sponsor, SSRCF, we could input this in 9fin and spits out previous cases with similar elements. And this is the detail on the restructuring, the details which took place on the restructuring. So that's like the pattern recognition point that, we have XYZ characteristics. What deal from what 5 deals or what deals from the last 5 years look like that? And that right now is, people remembering, and that's kind of experience people get. But is there some tool where you could just, pull up the relevant?
There are. I mean, so we kind of do things like deal predictions and helping people find precedent transactions that have certain characteristics. So we can do some of that today at 9fin. I think it also comes down to how sophisticated the transaction is. So for example, if you're saying, hey, I just want to find some candidates for repricing, and anytime there's a new potential candidate for repricing, that's something we can configure very easily and just alert you as soon as it happens, rather than you having to go and check manually, or deals that have their non-call period roll off. That's also something where you can quite easily set up alerts or notifications to be monitoring in an automated fashion for whether there might be a business opportunity. If you're getting into more kind of complex restructuring world, if it's looking for deals that had certain characteristics, that's quite straightforward. If you're saying, how do I structure this transaction, or can the company do a J. Crew style transaction, or is there that's going to be much more complicated to get a good answer, because you're going to have potentially 20 different debt documents. You might be able to get an answer to, is there a J. Crew blocker in all of the bonds for this deal?
Right.
But saying, is there some nuanced legal workaround that we can get to that no one's thought of yet? That's a much more difficult and sophisticated question. And a lot of this stuff also ends up getting litigated over the actual meaning of the words themselves. So, I don't know what exactly what would ChatGPT have said about open market purchases prior to the court case being decided. So I think there's still value in the nuance, and there's more complicated problems will be harder for kind of AI to solve.
Yeah. I'd be curious to hear, just in the conversations you're having with clients, potential clients, and you're just in this world, what you've seen in terms of like adoption across firms of technology, and what the barriers have been, or the objections, or the hesitancy. We've talked about this a little bit already. There's obviously a regulatory component, and these are legal documents and transactions that are eventually often heavily litigated. There's obviously financial regulators, and there's going to be a lot of people in compliance who are going to be pretty worked up about this one way or the other. But that said, it's powerful stuff, and if there's a source of competitive advantage, and someone wants to be the first mover, you could see people some firms wanting to push the envelope. So, I guess what are you seeing in terms of those kinds of just questions around adoption, and that there's internal debates about how quickly or not to move?
There's a spectrum. I mean, there are some firms that we speak to who are allergic to any kind of mention of AI or LLMs because they're fearful about the kind of trustworthiness of the output or how their data might be used. And so they just put up a wall and say, if it's got AI anywhere near, we're not touching it, which I think they will not be able to maintain that position forever.
Yeah.
And then there's some other folks who are much, much more forward thinking that we speak to in terms of adoption, where they have real world problems that they're tackling in their day to day, that they realize the potential of things like LLMs to tackle and help solve. And they know that at 9fin, we've spent a long time applying technology to solve real world problems in this space. And so we're working with a lot of clients on some quite cool stuff. But I think it's that you also get some people in the market where, there's a lot of hype at the moment, and people are still in the experimentation phase. And I think you have to really focus on what is the real world problem that this technology is solving for you. And we've never been ideological at 9fin about saying, oh, it has to be solved by AI, or we're going to be a general AI company. And there are some kind of quite scary client calls where you say to them, okay, you're using one of these kind of other generic AI tools, and you've paid for it. What problem is it solving for you? And people kind of look at you a little bit blankly and are saying, and then you say, well, why did you onboard it? I said, oh, we saw it raise a lot of money, and we heard that some of our competitors used it. And my favorite one was,
hopefully they're saying about 9.
Yeah, no, not about us, but and what they said was, our CEO was really fed up of having nothing to talk about at conferences when people said, what are you doing with AI? And so we bought this tool so he could say something. And so, I mean, those are the scary use cases in terms of hype. And so we're always really focused on, what's the problem we're solving? Is it an earnings call? Is it summarizing results? Is it, searching through our databases and making sure that that an LLM is the best tool to solve that actual workflow problem and drive value for the clients, because that's ultimately how they're only going to pay for the long term.
And have you seen anything about just how internally people are being trained, junior level, entry level? We had this question earlier. Obviously, when we were analysts in banking, we learned Excel, but then there was shortcuts from some prepared shortcuts, and the firms often have shortcuts, and there's Capital IQ and FactSet, and those can download trading comps, but you can do those yourself. And there are all these internal debates about how much to rely on that, because the more you can process quickly, it's the more you can pitch books you can do and more meetings you can do. And there's pros and cons, right? So as the AI and tech concept, how much of that is filtered down to just the day-to-day work and even the training people are getting who are doing the actual
It's a tricky one for me to answer because I'm now out of that world in terms of I'm no longer the analyst kind of in the trenches, but I guess my kind of
have you seen some of the technology? There are and I wrote about this last year, but there's companies that are offering financial modeling. They can do the LBO and snap of a finger, and some of the big private equity firms have their own solution, and it seems pretty powerful and pretty good. And but those were human tasks before that require a lot of judgment.
Yeah, I think especially when you're in the early stages of your career in banking or in a law firm, I mean, you're working a lot of hours, and anything that you can use to help get you kind of home to bed a little bit quicker and be more efficient in producing the work for your clients or for your MD or for your boss is something that you very quickly learn to adapt to, regardless of whether it was informal training, but maybe one of your peers or colleagues said, actually, if you use these shortcuts, you can cut the time it takes to do this in half. Right. So I think as a kind of general instinct, folks in those roles in the earlier part of their career are always looking for ways to get stuff done quicker and more effectively. And so the take up of these tools, provided it's allowed at these firms, should be a route for people to do their job better and faster.
Yeah. Well, we have another question here. Is the success of these AI models contingent on being able to access licensed data, e.g. MSCI or Bloomberg?
I mean, one of the challenges.
I guess what are training these models more generally?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them have been trained on, and it's quite contentious over whether they've been trained on copyright materials, but I think broadly everyone agrees they've been trained on the internet. And
which is a lot of
it's a lot of stuff. But there is a lot of information that isn't Googleable. Things that are on Bloomberg or MSCI or things that are announced, things that are proprietary. And so that kind of lack of training on that information is one limitation of the models. The other limitation is the base models anyway they kind of have a cutoff point in time. And financial markets and data in financial markets moves fast. So you probably need some kind of input into whatever system you're building internally that relies on some of that licensed data, whether it's from Bloomberg or 9fin or an MSCI, in order to get the best answers and the right answers whenever you're asking questions to these LLMs.
Yeah. And so if we put all this together, and still very, very early, but there is a question everyone's thinking about it. You're thinking about it as obviously a technology and data and reporting provider. The bankers and lawyers are thinking about it. The investment buy side is thinking about it. Is this fundamentally going to become a different? Is investing going to be a fundamentally different job? We talk about a Kodak moment. There's just going to be some kind of sea change. And we lived through the internet. That was a big deal. That did change a lot. But job, itself kind of stayed the same. It was a little bit easier, probably more than a little bit easier. But it was still the basic skills. You could just do them with more ease. Do you have a prediction on are we going to actually just have robots in the investment committee, and this can be a totally mechanical process? Maybe aspects of restructuring, which is a true negotiation, but how much of this is going to be automated?
I think you can look at some of the different workflows that all of our kind of different client types do, and some of them are much more susceptible to automation through things like AI than others. Certain components of putting together a pitch deck, you tend to use cookie cutter slides with raw inputs that typically come from internal database or external sources. No one enjoys doing that type of work, but that type of work, generating slides, things like that, should be something that LLMs can do. So I think you end up with lots of kind of LLM models or AI agents that do different parts of the individual workflow.
Yeah.
I guess the question is then whether you join the dots across all of them and you have some kind of AI analyst that can do everything. I think we're quite a far away from that. But certainly...
That sounds like a little bit, right? Because you are talking about analyzing text right now in earnings calls, and that's useful, but it's still just a tool.
Exactly. And also I think what these models are great at is analyzing text. And a lot of debt markets, whether it's a prospectus, whether it's a report or a presentation or a company's earnings or a news article, is unstructured text. And so kind of using that data to get to some useful insight they're very good at, but also a very large part of finance and of working in leverage finance is the financials, the numbers, the projections. You're looking management in the eye and thinking, do I believe the story that they're telling?
Yeah.
And so I think some of these things are much more difficult to kind of
I
think
mean, do you
of as
think
being
there's a model
automated
like
away.
this? There's a model coming where, you know, you just look at like total leverage, like debt to EBITDA, for example, and that looks like it's okay, and it kind of works. But then if you're a human analyst, you would look at interest coverage, for example, that, you know, was under 1 or whatever, under 2, whatever number you want to use. Like, then that's like a red flag. Is there a model that's going to be able to like look at like 10 different outputs in a pitch book and say, you know, this is the concern, this kind of works, and this valuation works or not? Are we there yet?
I think you can get some of those data points and, you know, kind of get a first pass of things like deal predictions or signs of stress for a company. I think the challenges are around the nuance, and also some of that financial information is backward looking, right? So it might be 5x levered today and you think it's okay, but actually, you know, from speaking to the management team that the outlook's terrible, it's going to be 10x levered in, you know, 3 months time. The model might not know that. Similarly, you know, the nuances around things like, hey, this is leverage, but, you know, what about IFRS 16? Have you adjusted for leases? Is this like for like? So I think some of that nuance is also going to be quite hard for these types of models to automate away.
All right, that's interesting. We got a question from Rachit Jain. What, in your opinion, are industries that can be adversely affected when AI reaches higher potential, e.g. staffing businesses which provide SaaS for staffing requirements, where AI models can replace the function by running the analytics through data provided? So that's an interesting question. I mean, we've been thinking about that too. I mean, there is, I think, a worry out there. There's a lot of software companies that are very popular amongst private equity firms, right? Because they're very leverageable. There's enormous operating leverage. The margins are very high once you reach like critical mass and you have like an installed base. But are all those software companies just going to get crushed by some AI solution? I know there's worry about that. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. You're in the software business, so maybe you're thinking about this too.
I mean, I think every business has to be asking itself, you know, kind of is AI or is an LLM going to kill our business, or is it going to really adversely impact it? And you know, when you're working in credit, you're thinking about downside risk, and you have a list of questions that you typically ask when you're analyzing a company. You know, does it have supplier concentration? Does it have customer concentration? You know, what's the fixed cost base of this business versus variable cost? I think one of the questions you have to ask is, what does AI do for this particular business in terms of potential disruption? And you see it in our space, companies that in the leverage finance world who, you know, are very reliant on call centers or on customer support. You're already seeing credit investors raising questions and saying, hang on, I'm not sure about the longevity of this business in this new world. And the software piece is probably one of the scarier ones, especially for a lot of folks in private credit, given how popular it is. If you look at, you know, these businesses are generally considered some of the best businesses in the world, really sticky revenue. And, you know, you have people like Klarna who are saying we're dropping a lot of our SaaS providers. You know, Salesforce, we're not going to use it anymore. The prospect of that kind of as a concept whenever you were writing your original memo 2 years ago just wasn't even on the agenda or the radar. So I think there are some businesses that are much more susceptible than others. Other kind of companies in our space, you think about Getty Images. If the business model is licensing photos or other business models where it's maybe music rights or licensing text, if you can generate an image on the fly for free at no marginal cost, with no restrictions, that's very challenging for a business model like for someone like Getty. So I think there are some businesses that are very susceptible to risks in this space. And the one that also interests me is the kind of second level or second order consequences. So, for example, now when you look something up on Google, you will get the kind of AI best guess response at the top that they've generated. And one of the knock-on consequences for that is that companies who were relying on Google traffic to click on their links to go to their site to get the answer have seen a massive fall in their kind of volume of traffic to their website. So those kind of things we've yet to see play out, but definitely people should be asking about this in their credit committees and looking at every single company through the lens of how does AI disrupt its business.
Yeah. It's a question from Adil Sattar. Do you see a difference in AI adoption in debt markets between regions, Europe versus US versus Asia? Part of this, I guess, is a regulatory question too, but there's a ton of obviously innovation like in the US and AI, which is thought to be as a leader. Europe, I think a little bit further behind, part of that is just because of the questions about regulatory compliance, and they've just been much more cautious than the US has, for better or worse. I don't know if you've noticed anything about any geographical differences in AI adoption or even development.
I don't think we've noticed a huge amount from our perspective yet. A lot of the deals that we work on tend to be global deals anyway, or negotiated out of New York. But I mean, there definitely are differences between the regions in terms of, even for the tools and services that we use, some of the Google tools, for example, in Europe will be off by default. You have to proactively switch them on due to regulation, whereas in the US, they're just on by default. You know, some of Apple's new AI features were only available to US users. So I think there is likely to be a kind of a difference in terms of the regulatory environment. Whether there's a difference in terms of people's willingness to use the tools and adopt them in their day-to-day role, I don't know. I think that's much less clear.
Yeah. Got one more question here. What are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you see with asset managers in terms of their approach to leveraging AI and tech and credit?
Challenges and opportunities. I think some of the challenges are that the data is very messy in our space. It can be quite difficult to get a hold of. It can be quite difficult to standardize. Obviously, at Ninefin, we try to help on that front.
Right. And that was one of the reasons you started the company.
Exactly. Getting access to data is one of the big challenges. Another challenge is overcoming the kind of internal objection to using these types of tools, or the compliance and onboarding process can be quite painful. But ultimately, the opportunity is that you can be more effective as a business, whether that's your team can look at more companies and more investment opportunities. They can spend their time more effectively. You can do more pitches. You can win more business. I think there's going to come a critical point where the winners in this space who adapt or adopt new technology and AI will ultimately outperform their peers, and they will be leaders and they will be laggards. And I think the firms who embrace that opportunity are the ones that are going to win in the long term. And that goes to the kind of Kodak moment. Do you embrace the change, or do you kind of resist it? And I think this is probably closer to a internet type moment than it is to a crypto moment, where we're still kind of waiting 15 years later for the big revolution, other than it just being a store of value.
I mean, on that note, when you're talking to clients and potential clients, how much do they ask or care about how you're embedding AI and ML and these advanced technologies, which they're reading about and maybe don't totally understand, into your product? Is that something that comes up? Do they care? Do you market yourselves using those tools? Or?
Absolutely, it comes up a lot. I think if you look at kind of debt markets, it's the largest asset class in the world, yet it probably has the most problems in terms of data and technology. And I think now at Ninefin, we're known as being a tech leader in this space. We probably have one of the biggest engineering and product teams in the world, using technology and AI to solve problems in this space. So people know when they engage with us, like Ninefin's at the forefront of developing new products and innovating. I think people are focused on how we're using data. Where do we get the data from? How are we using their data? And generally we don't use any of our clients' data in terms of how we train models or how we use the platform. And also we've always used a lot of technology or AI in the background of how we get the data onto the Ninefin platform. But the big shift with LLMs is people can now interact with it. They can ask questions on Ninefin through the search, and what are the risks for this company? What does it do? Or they can see the kind of summaries of news articles or transcripts of earnings calls that previously they hadn't been able to see before. So people are focused on it and are interested in it, and how interested in how it can make their life easier. But they are also nervous about, for example, one of the things we built in is to kind of make sure that the answers we're giving are correct. And the kind of cardinal sin in finance is to be confidently wrong. And one of the risks with some of these models is you ask a question, you get an answer back that's completely wrong. And so having things like
the wrong cases.
Exactly, the wrong cases, or and one of the ways that at Ninefin we've been able to apply some of the LLMs specifically to our space is having an audit trail. The equivalent of the footnote in the presentation, that when your boss says, "Where did this number come from?" You say, "Well, here's the footnote. Here's where it came from. You can trust it." And that's something else that we've kind of built into how our product works.
Yeah. I guess maybe the place to wrap up is to ask you two questions. They're both predictions. So what's a prediction for a near term, like in the next year? Like what's the next big thing you're going to see in AI in credit markets, either in the Ninefin business or just broadly at credit? And then maybe 5 years out or 10 years out, like what does that look like, sort of long-term or medium-term prediction or projection?
Crystal ball gazing is dangerous. So I think some of the stuff that we're kind of excited about is, I think we were the first people in the world in kind of any of the credit platforms to launch kind of a ChatGPT style Q&A tool or service that you could use to kind of ask questions about credit. And I think we're on our 5th version of that already. And with each version, we add more data sources, whether it's like, SEC filings or company financials or capitalization tables or instrument data. And so I think a lot of
So what's a question that's like that answers well?
Yeah, so you say like, what are the key risks for this business?
Yeah.
Or, what's the outlook for LTs? And it'll leverage all of the data sources that we have and also the proprietary content that we produce to give you a pretty good answer. But those answers are getting better and better the more data we integrate and the more types of data that we integrate. So I think kind of having an AI assistant that can answer a lot of questions about LevFin stuff is something that in the next year is only going to get better and better and better. And also, so far, we've been very focused on applying it to a specific company. Ask a question about a specific company, get an answer. I think we'll be able to broaden that even more to say things like, hey, what's the current repricing wave, and what's going on? How many issues have repriced, and answer some of the questions that an analyst might get asked by their boss to put in a presentation or in a pitch deck. You could just ask 9fin AI and it'll give you the answer, help you generate the slides. So I think some of those types of workflows we're going to have a big impact on with our kind of 9fin AI tool. And then the other kind of longer term is harder to tell. I'm not sure how many people 10 years before the internet kind of was fully adopted would have been able to foresee exactly where things would shake out.
You expect there's going to be like really big breakthroughs, and they're saying just generally that we're getting closer and closer to AGI, and people get very excited about what the possible, every week there's more hype. It's amazing. Do you buy that, or are you more cautious about how truly revolutionary this could be? Because just the broader question, right? There's so much investment we read every day about the new fundraising for these companies and how much is going into power companies and data centers, and like it's a lot, and like the hype is extraordinary, and like the payoff has to be extraordinary for all this money to actually earn a return. So do you have some broad confidence or optimism that it's like going to be just the most game-changing thing of our life?
It's a big question. It's really hard to tell.
Yeah.
I mean, 2.5 years ago, when people first saw kind of ChatGPT, they might have been thinking, "Oh, we're going to have like kind of humanoid-style companion that can answer any question, could do anything for me, in the palm of my hand." We're not quite there yet. Some of the kind of I don't have an AI or a kind of engineering background, but some of the models seem to be plateauing a little bit in terms of the current approaches.
Yeah.
So we will see, but there's a lot of capital being poured into the space. I think it's nearly, or maybe more than 50% of venture capital funding is now going to AI-related companies, which is massive.
Yeah.
And you have breakthroughs like DeepSeek in China, which caused massive sell-off in a lot of US tech stocks, which has kind of since come back. So it's really hard to tell the 10-year kind of story of where we think things will be. Do I think we'll have kind of AI analysts, automatically generating pitches and speaking to CFOs and winning business and mandates? I think it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of avoiding the question of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to continue to experiment in this space, and I think we're not trying to build a kind of generalized artificial intelligence for LevFin. It's more, let us help you find workflows and problems and challenges that you have, and let us tackle them with technology to make your life easier and better, and help you win as a business or as an individual. And so we spend a lot of time with clients brainstorming how we can apply new technologies to their challenges, and there's a lot of exciting stuff out there in the next 5 to 10 years.
Good. Well, that's a good place to end this conversation. Very interesting views about where we have been and where we're going. So appreciate the time.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for listening.